welcome with me to talk about first the 1947 partition and so many other tragedies that this nation and the world has seen. Aanchal Malhotra is a historian. She is a co-founder of the Museum of Material Memory. Partition पे बहुत लिखा है इन्होंने, literary family के से आती हैं ये. Samuel Dalrymple is also a historian. He's a partition scholar. He's a co-founder of Project Dastan. देशों के जो बॉर्डर के बियॉन्ड होते हैं, जिनकी कहानियां हम नहीं सुन सकते, बहुत दशक बीत जाते हैं. हाउ डू यू ब्रिंग दी स्टोरीज टुगेदर? सो ये कॉन्वर्सेशन किसी एक या दो लोगों के बारे में नहीं, तो इनकी ये किताबें जो है फॉर एग्जाम्पल ये आंचल ने लिखी हैं, द लैंग्वेज ऑफ रिमेम्बरिंग. सो आंचल, लेट्स बिगिन विद दैट एज द फर्स्ट क्वेश्चन. Aanchal's book is about objects. Partition we've all heard about. It's been spoken about, written about, documented quite a fair bit of India partition. But your fresh approach was to have objects that people have carried with them from India to Pakistan, Pakistan to India, Bangladesh, all of that. Why did you think an inanimate object can make for a human story to be retold in a way that many of us have not heard?
Thank you for that question, Pooja. जब ये काम शुरू करा था 2013 में, four of my grandparents came from across the border.
Both sides, that
Both
means.
sides. लेकिन किसी ने partition के बारे में बात नहीं करी थी. So I didn't grow up with any stories. And when I started to ask about these stories, they would ask me questions back. If I would say, उस वक्त क्या हुआ था, they would say, पर तुम्हें क्यों पूछना है? तुम्हें क्यों जानना है? What will it change? And it felt like there was a lot of hesitation and reticence to approach the subject of partition for many reasons. Maybe because of what it reminded my grandparents, or they did not want to disclose something.
They did not want to burden you with their memories?
That is also a valid point. But I really wanted to understand my origin and where they came from. And so I started asking them about the objects they had carried. बड़े आम चीजें जैसे बर्तन, jewelry, small foldable knife. And through those objects, we started talking about their life in what became Pakistan, and their school, and their home, and their families. And ऐसा लग रहा था कि जब वो चीजों के बारे में बात कर रहे थे, they were more open. And they were more willing to share. And I think that the object acts as a catalyst for remembrance.
Objects like what? Can you tell our audience, ऐसा क्या लोग निकले होंगे जिनके पास वक्त नहीं है भागने का? What do they carry and why do they keep it for them for 50 years and then want to talk about it?
If you ask anybody, any refugee, because refugee is still a very topical word, what would you carry? Or if I ask you, if your house is burning, what do you take with you? You will have varied answers, obviously, depending on how much time you have to pick up things. This is how it was with partition also. Depending on how much time people had to take things, depending on what they knew about partition, whether they thought it was going to be permanent or not, they took many things like books, shawls, very mundane stuff, apne ghar ke bartan, weapons to protect them along the way. And then they took valuable things like jewelry or maybe money, or clothes. And then they took really bizarre things also, like लाहौर में मैंने एक बार देखा था एक 15.5 foot crocodile carcass. किसी ने अपने youth में crocodile मारा था.
वो victory sign है मेरा.
Exactly.
So when I have to flee from a tragedy, I take the carcass with me.
It is not always tragedy, right? Some people fled prematurely. Some people fled after. Exactly. जो आपका social status था उस वक्त, it will determine how much people carried. So in that sense, the object is a great ethnographic tool to understand the realities of partition.
एक दुल्हन अपना माथा टीका साथ ले गई.
Correct. And ये objects, when you show them to children or grandchildren, they become conversation starters as well, right? Like, it's very difficult to start talking about traumatic history. But something very small as a ring, कि ये ring मैं रावलपिंडी से लाई या मैं लखनऊ से लाई, और लखनऊ ऐसा होता था और गलियां ऐसी होती थी और हमारे neighbor ऐसे होते थे. You know, I think that allows subsequent generations to imagine a
hua
land
tha?
that is across the border.
Imagine today you have a set house, a set family, and you're already always buying, you don't have space to keep, and somebody tells you for some reason that you have to flee and you have nowhere to go. What will you pick up? You know, these, imagine our ancestors, many of us, at least in this belt, so to say, have faced. So, Aanchal, let me take this question to Samuel also. आपको देख के लग रहा होगा कि Samuel तो Indian नहीं है, ये partition पे क्या लिखेंगे? Samuel, originally you're from a Scottish family, if I'm correct. He's also the son of a very prominent, popular writer, William Dalrymple, but I can tell you that he's as Indian as any of us. The sort of work he's put in to document stories that concern us directly, so to say, he's put in that effort and research. But you've gone beyond the subcontinent. You're talking about the making of Asia, Burma, Middle East even. Why did you think that in 2022 you want to go way back and talk about divisions that have happened then? And how difficult is it? How do you look back? How do you go back and contact these people?
So I began very much inspired by Aanchal's work. And so my first project to do with partition was called Project Dastan, where we were interviewing partition families that had migrated and then trying to put them in touch with families on the other side of the border, say in Lahore or in Rawalpindi or in Karachi or in Dhaka, who could show them what their house looked like today, what their school looked like today. And the more that I spent time traveling in these border regions, particularly in the Northeast,
Yes.
I began to realize quite how connected South Asia was to other borders, so Burma being the
Correct.
major one,
Yes.
and how many conflicts arose not just out of the partition that we know of today, but Burma was part of the Indian Empire until 1937, just a decade before Pakistan was separated. And that division also cut through families. It divided, for example, the Naga communities. Burma also has a Nagaland.
Rohingyas and all of it.
Rohingyas are also a divided community that are divided by that border. And so I wanted to look more into that and look more into...
Is it easy? Is it difficult to go look for these people? How do you approach them as someone who does not look like them? They do not know what you're going to pen down. How difficult is it?
I think a lot of it has come from conversations with, a lot of the original conversations has been with academics sitting in Delhi or in London, who I've chatted to about my research, or actually on Instagram. Instagram's been a major
Correct.
thing of when I put my research on social media, people message in to say, hey, my family made the similar migration.
So someone somewhere, Aanchal, writes to you on social media and says, oh, we have a similar story. Connect with us. Does that happen to both of you?
All too often, yeah.
Yeah?
The whole time.
What does that happen? How does that work out? Does someone message you, say, I had a grandfather or a grandmother, or meri bhi nani dadi ki ye kahani hai. Sam, you want to take that?
So with Project Dastan, we began basically, before we'd done anything, we created an Instagram account basically to tell these stories of the people that we'd interviewed who one day we hoped to take back. And
Take back to Pakistan or India.
The idea was to create VR experiences, so
Okay.
virtual reality. You can put on a headset and look around a kind of 360 view
ये
of your
नई
old school.
technology आई. It's a VR technology. The youngsters may know. I'm telling other people also. VR से आपको ऐसा लगेगा वो 3D है कि आप वहीं बैठे हैं और you can actually look back to what has happened.
Exactly.
So you build that.
So we had this and we were posting about it on social media. And there was a point, particularly just before the pandemic, where literally every 2 weeks we were getting requests. Because as, someone started to share one thing and then it would somehow work its way down a network of kind of WhatsApp groups, Instagram groups, that kind of thing. And I know that you've had the same thing of the moment that you start giving a kind of platform to talk about partition stories, people
Aanchal,
want
tell us
to
one
get their
story. I mean,
stories out.
this is a big book. It's the language to, if I read it correctly, the language of remembering. So why this volume? Why not let's say, have a short book, a crisp book, but you've documented everything, but one story that you can tell our viewers that they should go and buy this book, that gives us goosebumps, that hame lage ki ye 70, 75 years pehle ye hua, and you could now document it in 2022, any impact that could happen. Tell us about one story that's close to your heart.
Firstly, I want to say Sam's story is also in this book. And again, because of the
Yes.
way Sam looks, you may not think he has a partition story, but this is what maybe we are all trying to say, that partition actually extends beyond just Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, Christian, Parsi. सबके पास कुछ ना कुछ कहने को है partition के बारे में, because it is really about displacement. So I was very honored to record Sam and his father's story in the book. But one of the stories that always stays with me, and it encompasses, you know, history, it encompasses social media, it encompasses younger people, is that this is a book about, my first book was about people who lived through partition, जिन्होंने अपनी आंखों से बंटवारा देखा था हिंदुस्तान, पाकिस्तान, बांग्लादेश में. लेकिन ये कहानी, ये किताब second, third, fourth generation के बारे में है, who have inherited these stories. बहुत बार मुझे बोला गया था कि पार्टीशन की कहानियां फर्स्ट जनरेशन के साथ खत्म हो जाती हैं, कि हमें, मेरी अपनी दादी मुझे कहती है, वी नेवर वांटेड टू पास द मेमोरी अलोंग फर्दर, क्योंकि हमें कोई कुछ दिखा ही नहीं, हम क्या बताएं, क्यों बताएं, बहुत दुखदार कहानियां हैं. बट in speaking to younger people, I have realized that there is a lot of curiosity, and Sam will agree, because not only is his team made of younger people, but all the people working on Project Dastan across the world are usually third generation. There is a curiosity in younger people to look beyond the border, to look beyond this very easy rhetoric of us versus them, to see where their families came from. एक कहानी मैंने अपनी पहली किताब में रिकॉर्ड करी थी about a man who was from Jalandhar, and he left during partition as a 16-year-old, and he always missed the house that he grew up in. उस घर का नाम था शम्स मंजिल. And उस घर के सामने, पुराने घरों के सामने प्लैक होते हैं, and usually they have,
आज भी अगर आप काफी ओल्ड दिल्ली में काफी आज भी नाम पुराने,
right, तो उस पे पोइट्री लिखी होती है, they are the family's names and all, and he always missed that house. And I think around 50 years after partition, 25 years after partition, he had the chance to go back to Jalandhar from Pakistan to visit that house. And वो बड़ी खुश थे कि घर खड़ा हुआ था, and he knocked on the door, and he met this Sikh gentleman who was now living in the house. And the man explained कि मैं पाकिस्तान से आया हूँ, this is the house I grew up in, ये मेरे परदादा ने घर बनाया था. And that Sikh gentleman says, now imagine, 25 years later, someone has come to say, I am the original owner of the house. The Sikh gentleman says, नाश्ता करते हैं पहले. So calls him inside.
The Punjabi tone comes through.
Correct.
Yeah.
And he's very proudly saying कि मेरे जो खत आते हैं, my post comes to this Shams Manzil address. The Sikh gentleman is very proudly saying that. So they have breakfast, and this house has now been divided into 4 different parts. So 4 families living here. The oldest resident of the family wants to meet this gentleman who's come from Pakistan. So वो कहती हैं कि बुलाओ उन्हें. And she's bedridden and very old, and now this young Pakistani man goes to her. He's probably now 40. He goes to her and she says, पुत्र मैनू दस, तू ठीक तरह पहुंच गया सी कि नहीं पाकिस्तान. Now imagine, here is a woman who's probably a refugee on her own, talking to a Pakistani who became a refugee in Pakistan and saying, did you reach okay when you fled to Pakistan? Then she says, कितने साल हो गए, so many years have passed, people from Pakistan kept coming to see their houses. You never came. Why didn't you come? We were waiting for you. And see, like people who have lived through this, the humanity that still exists, you know. So now this Pakistani gentleman sees the house, he's very happy, everything is still here, he goes back. 25 years after that, his niece comes to Jalandhar and sees the house is being demolished. And she takes permission of the current owners and takes this plaque back to Pakistan. Many, many years after that, after I write the book, these 2 sisters write to me from America. And they say, you know, we bought your book for our grandfather because he really likes to read partition literature. And he was going through the book. And he is the current owner of Shams Manzil. He is the Sikh man who welcomed that Pakistani man after partition. That is his house. That's the house my mother grew up in. And the coincidence, you know, like, it's so
someone reading something that you've done. So, कौन सी कहानी आप पढ़ते हैं, कहाँ से आप connect करते हैं? Maybe you have nothing to do with partition. Maybe none of your people have suffered, but there's a human connect. It's the human nature that you've brought out to your books.
That house, he was the gentleman who opened the door and said, "Pehle nashta." I mean, imagine. So I think at some point we can really connect the dots, and despite the border and despite what relationships between India and Pakistan are, Indians and Pakistanis can definitely learn to...
And specifically, I think who've stayed there, maybe,
Right.
who've seen what has
Right.
happened. I relate to
Yeah.
it in different circumstances. For example, I document the Hindu Kashmiris. So the massacre and the mass exodus that they've faced, and in many ways it still continues. The circumstances are different, of course. But I am brought up around conversations of every family who talks about a burnt house or a refugee camp, or how they started a life with nothing, a bag. And, for me, many people have often said to me, and these conversations have shaped me in a way that many of my friends cannot understand. But I know people who have told me, "Yaar, ho gya na, purani baat hai, event of the past hai, chhod do." I want you to answer that that it does impact second and third generation. You didn't suffer partition. You didn't see what your grandfather as an army officer had seen. But it does make a second, third generation have a certain view of how things were. So why do you think as a third generation, calling it an event of the past is an incorrect view or a term to address any tragedy?
Very simple things. I mean, I'm just thinking of all the things that my interviewees have said to me in the book. Native village. जब हम लोग छोटे होते थे, summer holidays में, everyone was like, मैं नानी के घर जा रहा हूँ, मैं नाना के घर जा रहा हूँ, मैं केरला जा रहा हूँ, I'm going to the hills. I didn't have a native village.
Exactly.
Right?
I feel exactly what you're saying here.
My nana nani live in a refugee colony. My dada dadi live in a refugee colony. They have businesses in refugee markets. Delhi is the only place I
I've
know.
known.
But is it mine? Like, I'm born here, but there are other places that are mine also. And I think this question came up again and again and again. Where are you from? Where is your native village? I have a friend who very casually on the phone was mentioning to me, वो लखनऊ से है, very casually he said, yeah, मैं बाग में खड़ा हूँ, मेरे परदादा ने ना ये आम के पेड़ उगाए. And I thought, oh my God, your great grandfather grew these mango trees and you're still standing in the shade. I don't even know where my grandparents' villages are. उनके नाम शायद बदल गए हों. So I think that in young people, not all, because there will always be parts of society that believe in the difference that partition caused, but a lot of young people are wanting to see where their families come from and maybe go there or reach out. Why do so many people reach out to Sam? Because they want to show their grandparents.
It's always the third generation.
Exactly.
It's never
I
the
want you
first
all
generation that reaches out.
to know something here.
Yeah.
In this book, there's a chapter called The Material Memory, where Sam has been interviewed also, and why. Sam's grandfather...
Maybe Sam, you could tell that story.
I will just briefly tell you because it gave me goosebumps and I will want him to explain. Captain Hamilton Dalrymple was your grandfather in the army. It's the last quote that she's put forth in the book that gave me goosebumps. Listen to this carefully. He's talking about his grandfather where he says, "Don't get me wrong. It would have been wonderful had he shared his memories. But there should be no obligation to speak. And I'm slowly learning to respect his silence." I relate to it because there are so many times survivors don't want to talk. Do you tell them? How do you tell them that they must? How do you know? What does it mean to respect their silence? Because you came across something, a scrapbook, and that changed your way forever. Tell us about that.
So I'd already been doing Project Dastan and spending my time interviewing partition refugees, trying to kind of reconnect them across the border for now 3 years. And my family had been based in Delhi since the 80s.
Yes.
And yet my dad's parents had never come out. So everyone else in our kind of Scottish world had come to visit, all of his brothers, that kind of thing. His parents had never come out. And our granddad would always change the reason. Each time we asked him, he would change the reason why he wouldn't come out.
Wouldn't come out to Delhi? To
Delhi.
India?
He would never visit. And each time it was like, oh, we'll come next year. Oh, we're ill, that kind of thing. And then he passed away about 5 years ago. And the night before his funeral, we found a scrapbook where he had been an 18, 19-year-old army officer posted in Delhi during partition. And it emerged that all of his friends had been put on one of the trains and none of them made it to the other side. and there were photographs of him standing literally kind of 25 minutes away from here, in front of Rashtrapati Bhavan, in front of Qutub Minar, doing a kind of tourist thing. And there were photos of him and these friends that he had never spoken about, not really once, despite us living out here for 30 years. It was kind of very strange to suddenly, it had always been a fight in our family that he wasn't coming out, and so to suddenly see him there was a very strange. And
what was in the scrapbook? Do you want to tell us? And we'll open now to the questions in the audience. Hindi mein, English mein, jaise aapko पूछना हो, जरूर सवाल करें. What was in the scrapbook that you found that you are standing today in Delhi?
Yeah.
And in areas where your grandfather would have been.
It was bizarre.
Yeah.
And
Tell
there were
us
kind of seated,
any sight?
there were photographs in front of the Qutub Minar. There was even there were like invitation cards to kind of Independence Day celebrations. There was a seating plan where kind of Gandhi and Jinnah.
Is this the August when
in August?
on the day?
No. So this was months earlier, and he had been working as the kind of assistant to one of the major army generals.
Wow.
And so he was like 19, but he was at the end of a table where at the top you could see people like Gandhi sitting there, and it was
Gandhi, Nehru on one side,
Exactly.
other side would be
Other
Jinnah.
side is Jinnah. Kind of Cyril Radcliffe is sitting six seats
And I
over.
remember, Sam, you were saying like up till now you'd been working on Project Dasam, but you never thought that you had any connection to partition. And I think finding that,
Really?
like his grandfather at the heart of partition politics,
I
you
think
know?
Britain generally has an amnesia about forgetting that.
It's a different
They
way
were-
of how they see the
Well,
partition.
as in Britain has systematically erased it from any curriculums, that no one is taught about empire in Britain. So, I grew up here, so I learnt it through being at school here. But I feel that these conversations do not appear in kind of most British people's homes. Even
Should
kind
it?
of-
Do you think that needs
Yes.
that needs a
Very-
change now?
I think the ones that appear are very like nostalgic of the Raj.
Or
Yeah.
You
it
know?
was a
And-
great, the sun never set.
Yeah.
Or even I think the 1857 is mentioned very differently as a mutiny in England to a revolt
Exactly.
here in India.
Whereas, I mean, as you and Kavita, who's our friend who's done a lot of amazing work on interviewing kind of British voices, be they kind of white British, British Indian, British Pakistani, whatever they might be. And her research has been fascinating in showing these memories in the
So
smallest of
you
towns.
were at the Qutub Minar, so was your grandfather. Do you
Exactly.
think God has brought you here in some way? Is it a full circle?
Maybe.
But there has to be, do you think it's just a coincidence?
I don't know, but it certainly was a kind of eerie, bizarre moment.
Aanchal, do you think this needs to be made into a film? How can this not be? Your grandfather was a British, or in the British Army, so to say, an officer, and a grandson comes, suddenly realizes a connection. And is this the interlink that you talk about? Also, that there's always some link that we have with these stories.
There were many links. Like I think the most important thing for Sam was to know that partition belonged to him.
Yes.
Of course it belonged to him anyway because he was working on it, but this made it so personal. And I think finding something after someone has died, you can't do anything about that.
But it's important to, as in it's a very different sort of memory and a different sort of story than, say,
Sam,
your
here
family.
again, what about people now that you're documenting and interviewing? How do you convince them to talk to you? How do you reach out to them? Because what if they don't want to?
Yeah, so this is something that's you've got to be very careful about. Very often, as I said, a lot of my interviews come from grandkids. It's always the third generation that reaches out over Instagram, over Facebook, and asks for me to interview their grandparents. And I've had a couple of times, particularly early on, where we started the interview and they basically said they didn't want to do it, but were being forced by their grandkids. And I think that I've got a very kind of firm line that
Is it
it's
the
got to
children
come
speaking
from-
that they wanted documented?
Maybe. Like I remember this one interview in Jammu
Yeah.
where I was invited by, again, the children to speak to their father. And the story they had told me was quite horrific. It's in the book that उनके एक family member की कुल्हाड़ी से leg काट दी गई थी, किसी को कमरे में बंद कर दिया था, कोई, someone was left behind. And I went there expecting to hear these stories. But when we got there were all these children sitting around this gentleman. And I said, क्या आप कुछ तो बताएं? And he was just like, मैंने नहीं बात करनी. And the children are saying कि वो गली की गल बताओ या ये बताओ. And he just didn't want to talk. And I really thought that, forgetting is as important as remembering, and you can't force someone to speak even if they have agreed to speak to you. You know?
I think those are very important, incredible words there. Let's open it to our audience. Koi sawal ho, koi questions ho about storytelling, about writing to these writers. Anything? Go ahead, sir. Yahan ek mic there, please. Pooche zarur. These are moments you may not be able to meet these writers. They're very busy and often elusive. So this is the moment. Go ahead, sir.
My name is Nikhil, and my question is to Aanchal ma'am. Ma'am, people like you who always are a little skeptical about their native places and like from where do I belong? So do you ever feel like having identity or existential crisis? Like this is the place where I actually belong to.
I don't think I have an identity crisis per se. I think we are just curious about where the origin lies. मतलब हूँ तो मैं दिल्ली से, हूँ तो मैं हिंदुस्तानी, ऐसा तो नहीं है कि कल मैं पाकिस्तानी बन जाऊंगी. You know, and I think it's very important to say that you can be one nationality but still feel for the city or village that your family came from. जो बुजुर्ग लोग हैं वो हमेशा शहर या गांव के बारे में बात करते हैं, वो कंट्री के बारे में कभी नहीं बात करते. Like people in Pakistan who have left from India, say cities like Delhi or Calcutta, they will never say India, they'll say Calcutta, they'll say Delhi. Similarly, people in India will say Peshawar, they'll say Rawalpindi, Pakistan नहीं कहेंगे. तो I think ऐसा कोई identity crisis नहीं है, लेकिन आप खुद ही सोच लें, अगर आपको अपनी नेटिव प्लेस कभी दिखे ना, मुझे पता नहीं आप कहाँ से हैं, आपको मन नहीं करेगा एक बार देखने का. तो बस यही है.
और कोई सवाल? Hands are now rising. I think suddenly people are realizing they have a lot to ask. दो तीन सवाल और ले लेंगे and फिर हम wrap up.
Hi, my question is to Sam. Since you said that most of the people who've connected you through Project Dastan are second or third generation, come from second or third generation, I'm curious whether second or third generation people from the UK or British second and third generation, do they see partition differently from let's say whose ancestors were already here? Do they have more empathy towards partition, or are they willing to engage in that conversation? Because this is a theme which has also come up very often in William Dalrymple's podcast, The Empire, that the British need to accept that this has happened. This is a conversation that they just shun. So have you come across any such instance?
Yeah, I think it's a rather confused response. I think that there's a lot of talk beginning, but it's the difference in the UK is that people have grown up, like, Indian origin kind of diaspora will have grown up around kind of people who migrated there from Pakistan, who've migrated there from Bangladesh. But they'll also, they'll have spoken about it less, and I think come to the topic much later in life, I think is a thing that I've definitely noticed. But I don't think that the responses in general have been completely different. I think that there's generally, amongst all kind of third generation people who've reached out to me, there's been a similar wanting to see where they're from. And I think that there's something, but I think amongst the diaspora, there's also, like, if you've got a British passport, it's much easier to visit there yourself, right? Like if you want to, you don't have the same restrictions on your passport.
Go ahead. Aanchal, let's take another question, then we'll add on to the answers. Ek piche le lete hain. Let's have a girl also answer in the green.
Hi, ma'am. I'm a very big fan of yours.
How lovely, good.
So I'm a history student. I was a BCom student, but I shifted my line to history because one was inspiration and your book, and Begum Aad Ke Aansu, I read that book. So yeah, that was the reason. And
what's your question? Do you have a question or is it a compliment?
Both.
Acha, both. Okay.
So ma'am, my question is, when people don't relate and they say ki ho gaya, but I don't have any background from Pakistan. My grandfather was from Sonipat. So, but I could relate to it. I like the stories as you mentioned of the Shams Manzil. Yeah. So, my question is, how can I work with you and learn more about these
That
things?
is your real question. Now you asked. इतना घुमा के. How can she work with you? आपको पसंद है इनके साथ काम करना? Interest
ma'am,
है
I would
आपको?
like to
Okay.
work with
We'll
you.
take another question and then you can answer her till then you can decide. Quickly one question. पूछे ये black में जो है यहाँ.
Hello, ma'am. My name is Plavan, and I am currently doing my master's in history from JNU, Delhi. So the other day I was attending a talk which was about this family that was affected by partition, and then they shared a very interesting anecdote that during the partition some members of the family they went to the other side and some stayed back. So what they used to do is they used to write letters to each other, and through those letters, the anecdotes of all that were happening back then was getting shared. So my question is, how easy or difficult do you think it is for the ones who are researching on this topic now to get access to this very intimate and very personal written sources, let's say a letter or a diary, which people would otherwise be very apprehensive to share with. So for these victims, how interested are they to share, and how easy or difficult is it for you to get access to these written documents?
I think it depends case by case. I don't think there's a general answer. मतलब कोई लोग बड़ी खुशी से आपको चीजें दिखाएंगे और कोई लोग नहीं दिखाएंगे. Like I remember one interview where I had to read everything and memorize it, and I was not allowed to photograph anything. But then there have also been instances where people have scanned letters and sent them to me. लेकिन एक और चीज मैं आपको बताऊंगी, divided families जो है ना, it's such a sad and sort of heartbreaking circumstance. क्योंकि more than often, as generations pass, as politics between India and Pakistan becomes worse and worse, as it is now, communication बंद हो जाती है. During the 65 war, All India Radio ने एक उर्दू अपना विंग शुरू किया था, और उसमें वो क्या करते थे, लोगों को कहते थे कि आप खत लिखें हमें, और ऑल इंडिया रेडियो का ना जो फ्रीक्वेंसी था, यू कुड हियर इट ऑल अक्रॉस वेस्ट पाकिस्तान और ईस्ट पाकिस्तान. यू कुड हियर इट इन लाहौर, यू कुड हियर इन रावलपिंडी. People used to write letters to the families that had been separated कि मुझे बताएं आप कैसे हैं, और वहां से खत आते थे, अच्छा मेरे आम के बाग यहाँ ठीक है कि नहीं. So that was one way that people used to communicate. अब वो भी खत्म हो गया है. So answering your question, very subjective, depends person to person. I hope you find what you're looking for.
Do you want that young girl as an assistant if she's willing to work for you?
जब अगली बार मैं किताब लिखूं तो जरूर बात करेंगे हम. फिलहाल तो मैं कुछ लिख नहीं रही हूँ आजकल, but you can always write to me over email and we can keep in touch.
I have one, two questions before I wrap up. This is, let's have Sam answer that. What I noticed with both of your writings and even with Project Dastan, that it's very sensitive in nature. You're talking about real people, and most of them or some of them are alive. And you're going beyond religious binaries that both ways people are used to. How important is it to be sensitive, slightly restrained if required in these writings while staying factually correct? Because, and how do you tell these people that I'm going to talk about you, this is what I'm going to write? So how do you do that, Sam?
I think this actually goes back to the first time I met Aanchal.
Yes.
Which was when Project Dastan began as a student enterprise, and we were kind of wide-eyed students in our final year of college who wanted to go around interviewing everyone. And Aanchal came to sit down with us, and we'd emailed her, and she basically kind of eviscerated us and said, "You've got it all wrong. You're going to traumatize everyone." But basically,
I gave them sound advice.
She gave us brilliant advice, which was to often let them talk about the sensitive things and focus on the days before, at least in the beginning, to kind of gain trust, focusing on the days before partition, focusing on where did you play as a child? Do you remember the taste of mangoes? Did you have any friends? Did you have any friends from the other community? And then, what did the village look like? What kind of celebrations did they have? Did they have Eid as well as Diwali?
Yes.
Those kind of questions.
And most of them did. So
Yeah.
again, the issue of sensitive and restrained, how important is that to not go for binaries, even if of course there may be to some level, but when you write, you want a human story to go out. How do you
Yeah.
look at that?
I mean, so actually a very good example of this was with our first ever reconnection, which was a Pakistani gentleman who'd migrated from Ropar in Punjab. And he, when we interviewed him, was kind of basically giving the kind of Pakistani nationalist narrative of kind of, we were massacred by Indians, were kind of sent us to concentration camps and that kind of thing. And then it was after the first interview that he called us up and said, hey, I actually have a photograph of my best friend from the village. And he came forward with a picture of a Sikh man called Narendra Singh. And he said, can you please find him? And suddenly, kind of 2 days later, it was a completely different conversation. And one that had we not been sensitive and kind of waited for him to come out with it.
And just have written about it. And
then we managed to find Narendra Singh's family living on the edge of Chandigarh and reconnected them. And so, the conversation that emerged from that conversation was an entirely different conversation to the one that we started off with the first time.
My name is Rishabh. I am presently pursuing history honors from Delhi University. My question is both of the panelists. So, is there a case of authenticity regarding that, since it's been more paraphrased generations from generations?
How much of it is second, third generation? How much of it is first? Actually, there's a lot of first generation also.
We've done interviews across generations. In both our cases, we've done interviews with survivors and descendants.
But that's just the time is running out, isn't it, Sam? Specifically for the kind of partition you're covering.
Yeah. So I think that both third generation and first generation stories are equally as valuable as primary resources, but in different ways, right? As in, as long as you're conscious about the fact that it's a third generation story, because, first generation stories aren't necessarily unbiased either, as with the story that I was just saying. It took him 3 days later until the kind of more whole-rounded story came out. So I think whatever oral history you go into with a sense of kind of listening, but also being aware of trying to, of the fact that memory is a confusing thing.
I think you're making a very important point that both first and third generation is important, and I'm sure you also found that.
Well, absolutely. I find it really strange that people say because you're young you can't empathize with the pain of partition, or you. I think that every archive is equally valid because impact of partition has not ended. And it is obviously impacting second and third generations, not just in our politics or the attitude towards people across the border, but in our behavior, in certain things, in so many houses, particularly with partition displaced families, hoarding, huge thing. People hold on to things. They don't want to let go of things. They will always have extra food on their side. They will never throw away anything.
Even this generation, the third generation?
No, but younger people see this as a habit, right? As an attitude. Like in my grandmother's case, she will never throw anything out. कि जब मैं मर जाऊं तब तुम फेंक देना. Or so many times people have said during the days of partition, we only ate one kind of dal. So now that dal is never made in our house. I feel like people pick up.
I documented a Sikh man who had come from partition, and this is important because he had the habit of hoarding food, and his family was forever angry.
Yeah,
because
it's
first
common.
he didn't want to share because he'd come from a moment of not being able to share. Then he was hoarding too much, and then they realized. And I'll ask that question to you because for him, he was an orphaned child. He actually walked with strangers and came to J&K, he'd settled, and he's now had a Khalsa bakery in Jammu region, so he became a popular baker. I think you remember that story as well. It's also about what people made of themselves from nothing. So intergenerational trauma, but also intergenerational memory that we have been.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you put it very correctly.
Yeah, I'm very wary to use the blanket term intergenerational trauma because yes, there is trauma, but not everyone considers the legacy of partition to be traumatic, which as I'm speaking sounds very weird to say. But for some people, it is about how their family overcome that difficulty, how they were able to rebuild, and they celebrate that. And I think I want to say in both our work, human memory is not chronological. When we think of something, we don't always think of it as in a linear one. We don't always remember directly. What we see is not always what we remember as well. Our memory is porous. It has the ability to change. और बहुत बार जो present में हो रहा होता है, that brings back our memory. So of course, the way in which families remember things will also be non-chronological, and they will remember good times and bad times. As in the case with this interview, Sam said, like you start off as very, one way and very two-nation theory, and then all of a sudden there is a human aspect, and you think, wait. Maybe they can find the friend I left behind.
Incredible. Sir, go ahead, please. One more question and then we'll wrap up. हाँ जी, पूछिए.
Hello. Hello, Aanchal ma'am. I'm a big fan of you. So first of all, I'm very happy to see you here. I have read your book
आपकी
Separation.
आवाज नहीं आ रही है.
Hello, hello.
हाँ, अब
Yes.
ठीक है.
So मैम मैंने आपकी ये बुक पढ़ी है सेपरेशन, पार्टीशन ऑफ सेपरेशन. सो मुझे बहुत पसंद आई एंड जेन्युइनली अभी मैं चाहता हूँ कि मैं इसकी जो हिंदी कॉपी है वो भी मैं ऑर्डर करने वाला हूँ. आई वेंट टू फकीर चंद बुक स्टोर एज वेल टू गेट योर सिग्नेचर्ड कॉपी बट मुझे वहाँ मिली नहीं. सो मैं भी 1947 पार्टीशन आर्काइव के लिए काम करता हूँ. सो आई हैव कंडक्टेड मैनी इंटरव्यूज और पार्टीशन.
I love that handle. 1947 archive social media पे है. वो बहुत stories document कर रहे हैं. You're doing very good work. What's your name?
साहिल शर्मा.
Very good.
सो आई हैव कंडक्टेड मैनी स्टोरीज. एज यू सेड कि अगर हम किसी उन पुराने लोगों से पूछते हैं कि आप कहाँ से हो तो वो इंडिया पाकिस्तान नहीं बोलते. जैसे मेरे जो नानी नाना है दे वर फ्रॉम पाकिस्तान, तखत हजारा. सो आई हैव अ इंस्टाग्राम हैंडल हजारे वाला मुंडा एज वेल. सो तो जब मैंने उनका इंटरव्यू कंडक्ट करा था तो दे सेड आई एम फ्रॉम पंजाब. मैं आज भी नहीं कहता मैं इंडिया से हूँ या पाकिस्तान से हूँ, मैं बस पंजाब से हूँ. तो द थिंग इज आई वांट टू आस्क यू कि मुझे ऐसा लगता है कि आजकल की जो जनरेशन है वो बहुत ही लेजी हो गई है. वो किताबें पढ़ना पसंद नहीं करती. उनको ये लगता है कि बस सामने दिख जाए और हम देख लेंगे. बट आपकी बुक में और जैसा हम इंटरव्यूज कंडक्ट करते हैं वो पार्टीशन की बहुत अलग स्टोरीज हैं जो आई गेस किसी ने नहीं सुनी है इतनी. तो आई वॉन्ट यू टू कि आप ऐसी बुक का कोई आपका इरादा है कि आप उसको वेब सीरीज में लाएं या फिल्म में लाएं. बिकॉज आई रियली
And
वॉन्ट.
Sam, you can also ask this. What
एंड मैं
about?
चाहूंगा कि आप वो करें क्योंकि ये पर्सपेक्टिव लोगों को दिखना चाहिए कि पार्टीशन सिर्फ किलिंग पे नहीं था.
That's a
Yes.
good point. एक तो OTT series one. Are you looking at that? Do you want that? Is this the platform that you can say it should happen?
बड़ी बातें हुई हैं उस पे और बड़े सालों से हो रही हैं. लेकिन हिंदुस्तान पाकिस्तान के बारे में चीजें बनाना बहुत मुश्किल और सेंसिटिव है. जब होगा मैं आपको बताऊंगी, पर मैं गुजारिश करती हूँ किसी ने सुन लिया आपको. हाँ.
Samuel, what about your project? Like, what are we looking? Because you're writing a book already, you must be busy with it. What do you want to tell our viewers right now? What should we expect that you're about to do next, apart from Dastan?
So, I mean, Dastan will hopefully be doing an exhibition showing all of the interviews we've been doing and some animated, episodes. That should be showing in the Partition Museum come
Okay.
January.
Okay.
Fingers crossed. And then, yeah, the book, hopefully out next year. So let's see.
I can see the enthusiasm. Very good. That's how it should be. I have one final question in case we'll see if anyone wants to ask and if we have time. There is a perception that because writing is not easy, it takes time, it takes effort, and you have to promote it also. Both of you come from literary families, so the perception that it must be easier for you. You have a famous father, you have a whole publishing group, so to say. Is it easy? Is it difficult? Do people take you for granted? That, well, you have everything in front of you. You know, you don't have to put in effort. How do I write a book? So do you want to clear that, is what I want to know.
The thing is, you may have everything, but you may not have the talent. You may have the talent, you may not know how to do it. But I don't think that everyone can have, despite having any kind of family, you have to put in the hard work.
Yes.
Because ultimately effort aapka hai, naam aapka hai. And for me particularly, and I know it may be the same for a lot of female researchers in Dastan, to be a female field researcher is not easy. Female journalist is not easy. There is a lot that gets thrown at you, that people assume about you.
They
that
don't want to
people,
take you seriously sometimes.
वो भी है. लेकिन I think what works for me is actually the writing. When you're sitting and you're engaging with the things that you've recorded, you're listening to the voices you have recorded, it is inspiring, and you know that you're doing something that will outlive you. It will live for so much longer than you because you're leaving it for generations that come after you.
Very important.
So,
Samuel, for
yeah.
you?
Yeah, I mean, we're
Is
listening.
it easy being William Dalrymple's son? And
Well, then I didn't come into this through writing initially, as in I came in through filmmaking. So we were doing these films and this VR, which was not, I wasn't expecting to come into the book kind of emerged as a result of COVID really, and suddenly not being able to travel and trying to, I had all this information, I had all these interviews. I was going to be making a kind of TV show about it, and then suddenly we couldn't travel anymore. Suddenly we couldn't be around 90-year-olds who we didn't want to infect with the virus, that kind of thing. And so, yeah, I kind of went into it through a kind of slightly out-of-the-way way.
And
but
found your way, really?
Yeah, let's see.
One more question. That we have 5 more minutes, right? So 1-2 questions. Good to see people asking. पीछे gentleman है, उनसे पूछ लें और यहाँ भी ले लें, एक ही साथ ले लेते हैं दोनों सवाल.
Hello. I just had a question, just out of curiosity. Most stories on partition are usually traumatic. But have you ever had an experience? Have you ever had a story wherein you were completely inspired by it, which you would like to share here?
Yes, absolutely. That's, you've hit the nail on the head. In fact, even if a story is traumatic, it can also be inspiring. And I think so many stories that we hear, like my own grandfather's story, coming from nothing, staying at a refugee camp for 10 years, opening a small bookshop in 1953 that now has become still a small bookshop, but is a well-known bookshop. That to me is a success story. But also I think there are a lot of stories that we don't think about when we think of partition, like stories of friends being separated, stories of friends being united, stories of lovers being separated and... I can't speak louder than that. Sorry.
No, one of the interviews that I did was someone migrating for love. This woman, Saida Siddiqui, who was from Lucknow, had migrated not because she was being attacked by mobs or anything to Karachi, but because of the fact that the language had changed. The language of instruction changed from Urdu to Hindi, and she found she couldn't compete. And she was a doctor, and it's very technical. And so she migrated to Karachi to be a doctor there. And her boyfriend at the time, Sarfaraz, she had to say goodbye to. And then 2 years later, he showed up at her hospital with a kind of note saying kind of, it's me, will you marry me, kind of thing. And, when their grandkids and they don't talk about the migration as something, anything other than a kind of moment of love.
Does this not take a toll
fascinating.
on you sometimes, Aanchal and Sam? Because I know it does. When you keep meeting such people, there is this just so much heartbreak and tragedy that people have seen. आपको लगता है कि शायद आप बहुत involved इतना हो जा रहे हैं, वो आप पे हावी होने लगता है. Have you felt that, Sam? Have you felt that, Aanchal? You want to take that first, Sam?
It was the first thing I told Sam, that in a couple of years you're going to be a very heavy person and it's going to be very difficult. But yeah, of course it takes a toll on you. You, as both young, we started when we were both quite young, you're forced to mature a lot faster because you have to take care of the sadness of others.
Your mental health.
Oh, वो तो बाद में आता है. There may be a long period before you realize that something is happening to you because your concern is, here is a person that may not be alive tomorrow.
Yes.
And I am speaking to this person and they are trusting me because it's a privilege to listen to these stories, So the first concern is your interviewee. And then comes you. And I think, yes, we need to take care of how we deal with it as well. But when you're sitting with someone, that's not what you're thinking about.
I was waiting, he's waiting.
Yeah.
We'll just take that question and we'll then have it. Yes. Puch lijiye, sir.
Yeah. My question is related to the previous question also. You both have done an extensive research on partition and you have brought out that the humanitarian side and the traumatic side of partition. I would just like to know that during your research and all your reading and writing, what would you like to say that this decision of partition on basis of facts and logic, what would you say whether this was a right decision or a wrong one? If we take perspective of development of nations,
as in
India
इनका
and
personal
Pakistan.
opinion क्या है partition को लेकर?
Yeah, though because they have done a lot of
Sure,
research,
we'll
lot
ask
of
them.
reading.
Sam, Aanchal, that's a complicated question though.
Sir, to be honest, neither of us were there at the time. So would partition have still happened had there not been violence? Would partition not have happened had the British not left? These are all, we can only speculate at this point. But in my interviews, I have heard both sides. I wish partition had not happened. I'm glad partition happened. I think the question now is not should partition have happened or not, because India, Pakistan, Bangladesh are unalterable realities of history. हम वापस नहीं जा सकते. Unification नहीं होगा. You know, what I think, at least for me, is very concerning is that 75 years later, we have not been able to become cordial with one another as neighbors, and which is damaging things like trade. You know, हमारी किताबें हम लोग partition पे लिखते हैं, we interview Pakistanis, वो हमारी किताबें नहीं पढ़ सकते, because books can't be. Similarly, वहाँ से यहाँ कुछ नहीं आ सकता. You know, so I think my concern is very much how are we looking forward.
Do you want to give us closing 3 tips, both of you, to someone who wants to write on the kind of work that you do? It's so fiction, but this is, Sam, it would be interesting because you're writing your first books to the young writers here. 3 quick tips, specifically if it's on a serious issue like this, it's non-fiction, it's talking about real tragedies.
Yeah, I think that the first thing that I would say is interview your grandparents quick, because that was the thing that, as you read out earlier, I didn't manage to do. And so many people haven't. Record them. They're a fountain of knowledge and you'll regret it if you don't. And I know that, you know, some of the people who I've interviewed who've, you know, even in the 5 years that I've been doing this, so many of them have passed away. We're losing this generation very, very fast. And soon it'll just be second-hand memories. And so record as quickly as you can, but also be sensitive.
Yes.
Obviously. And also just, yeah, like, talking is healing in many ways.
I think the one piece of writing advice I give for myself when I write is to write for the future. My ancestors did not leave any written records for me, which is why people like us find it so difficult to actually piece stories together. And I always want to think about what future generations will want to know about us. So that's the advice I follow.
You are documenting. That's an aspect. I think both of you are doing incredible work. It's no less than a revolution in writing. This is documentation. I wish you all the very best. First, this is The Language of Remembering. It's a big book, but you should buy it. It's about the partition. This is by Aanchal Malhotra. Go check out Project Dastan. It's on social media. It's on website. Incredible documented stories. And as Sam said, talk to your family members if they're still around. आपको नहीं पता है कौन से रिश्तेदार के पास कौन सी कहानी है that you can learn from. Thank you so much for joining us. Aanchal Malhotra, Samuel Dalrymple, for being with us on the stage, taking all the questions, and for being a lovely audience, and for staying through the discussion. Thank you very much.